What is the condition of free speech in America today? I'm Sanford Unger, Director of the Free Speech Project at Georgetown University. On this series, Speaking Freely, we talk from time to time with thought leaders and major players in the free speech drama unfolding in America. Today, Eugene Scott, a political reporter for the Washington Post and a fellow at the Georgetown Institute of Politics and Public Service. Eugene Scott, I am very interested in your notion of what identity politics has done to us, and then especially what it's done to free speech in this country. How have we gotten to where we are?
Well, I would start with saying identity politics is not this new thing, right? I think we just are aware of it now in ways that we're not. And the working definition I would use for identity politics is the idea that individuals' identities, plural, shape their view on policy issues, politics, and other matters. And so we all have multiple identities. They all inform how we see the world. And so that's not new. That's always existed. I think in this last election, we saw more than we had before, that different people from different sectors of the American population saw the country and the world differently. And people were leaning into that in how they decided to vote. And I think in ways maybe different from previous elections, people were thinking about how they wanted the world to look based on their own identities, without much regard for how that impacted other people's identities, in maybe ways we hadn't seen before. And I think that may be a shift we're seeing right now.
And how does that affect our dialogue about the big issues of our time and how we're going to handle things?
I think groups are talking to one another about issues with levels of ignorance about the history of issues in that other group at levels we hadn't seen before. So I remember seeing a report recently that said the majority of millennials did not know some really basic facts about like the Holocaust and anti-Semitism. So that probably shapes how you respond to Jewish Americans when they are expressing concern about seeing some traits or trends that remind them of a very dark period in their history. A surprisingly low number, I believe like 8% of high school seniors, according to a recent survey, know that the Civil War was connected to slavery. And so when you are talking to, it was really low, when you're talking to Black Americans in the South particularly, who are constantly surrounded by memorials celebrating slavery to the Confederacy, and they are very sensitive to things, ideas and policies that seem sympathetic to people who supported slavery. When you don't know any of that history, you probably dismiss them sometimes, or think they're exaggerating in ways that you wouldn't if you actually knew these things.
So how do we repair these gaps in knowledge without sort of resorting to propaganda or to thought, to sort of trying to tell people how to think?
Yeah, I think there are a couple of things. One, we could make like a concentrated effort to get out of our bubbles, right? You don't have to always be in your bubble, but at least have some exposure to people in worlds outside of your own. Be it as simple as like following people on Twitter or Facebook who have different political leanings and put out think pieces that would never come into the echo chamber that you would choose for yourself. And also like taking trips to parts of the country, if not world, where you would be forced to interact with people that are different from yourself. So I don't enjoy traveling. I travel a lot, but I don't really enjoy traveling. And I say I don't enjoy traveling because the process to get to an airplane is just
not what it used to be.
Oh my goodness, it's so uncomfortable and unpleasant now. And I'm a creature of habit. Like I lose my wallet and my keys when I'm traveling in ways that I don't when I'm at home because I know where they are. But I travel in part because it exposes me to different people, different spaces, different ideas that I wouldn't normally get exposed to in the bubbles I move in DC. And the reason why that matters to me, just not professionally, obviously I write about identity and how different groups are processing things through America, across America, but I think having knowledge about the world outside my world just makes me a better citizen. It makes me a better human being. And I think one of the things we're seeing in our highly tribalistic times is people are talking to other people as if they're not even human. And it makes it really difficult to find common ground in policy making.
Is there anybody who's excluded from that dialogue? I mean, are there some people with such ideas that have been rejected, have been shown to be wrong over time? That, I mean, one of the things we keep hearing is, well, we have to listen to everyone's point of course we have to listen to every point. Every point of view has to be expressed, but does every point of view get the same reception as every other point of view? Do the people in Charlottesville, for example, the racist, anti-Semitic, white supremacist people in Charlottesville, do they, quite honestly, deserve the same audience, the same platform as others?
So I would not say that all voices matter. But the reality is whether or not they deserve the same platform, they're getting it. And so, I mean, people who are touting white supremacist ideas are getting invited to speak at like tier 1 universities and give keynote lectures.
Or inviting themselves to speak.
Or inviting themselves to speak, and universities are allowing it for various reasons. And people who are chanting Jews will not replace us are having the President of the United States blame both sides as if there's equal weight happening
Many
there.
fine people on both sides.
Many fine people, despite the fact that a white supremacist at that rally actually killed a woman with his car who was protesting against racism. And so there's a lot of debate about whether or not these voices should be heard. The fact is there are people who are listening, and I think the focus perhaps should be on how do you respond to these
we can't
ideas.
deny they exist.
You can't. I mean, if they have Wi-Fi, they're going to tweet.
Right.
Yeah.
And then as my students often say, if they don't get to speak, their voices, their views will be driven underground.
Sure, sure. And what was long viewed as being underground has now risen to the mainstream in so many ways.
Right. Well, it's accessible.
Right.
Which it might not have been before.
Absolutely. And speaking of the accessibility of ideas, I also think that regarding identity politics as a whole, ideas are just more accessible, right? So a lot of pushback to identity politics is this idea that we're in this highly divisive time, and some people say, Obama was the most divisive president because he more than any president before him acknowledged how many different groups existed in America in many of his speeches and what he celebrated. But the reality is all of these ideas were there before. All of these voices were there before, but now people have social media and can articulate them. And so we're now hearing people from Native American communities in rural Arizona share how they feel about the opioid epidemic because they can.
Right.
And we didn't know that before.
So, and yet at the same time, when we democratize access to the media, access to being heard, it means we're hearing some things that are not only hurtful, but sometimes quite shocking.
Yeah, and people are shocked for multiple reasons. One, they're shocked because they're offended or they think that idea is inappropriate. But what's also interesting, and you probably encounter this when you're dealing with like first-year students, some people are shocked simply because they didn't realize people thought differently than them. right? There's a lot of like, how could you possibly see the world that way? Well, I'm not you, and I didn't grow up where you went, and we went to different faith communities, and our parents are of different faiths and socioeconomic statuses, and so that's how I view this differently. And so the shock comes from a lot of different places.
Isn't that a failure of this culture, though, and a failure of this society to have young people arriving at college or university not having known that everyone doesn't believe the way they do?
To some degree, right? You have to be aware that the world is bigger than you. And I think the students that you're getting are aware of it in ways that maybe I wasn't, or students 10 years before, just because they are being exposed to so many different ideas because of social media. But all of us, no matter how hard we work, are going to be in bubbles to some degree.
And I suppose
right?
that's true, yes.
And so you're going to arrive to school with some level of ignorance. I remember as a first-year student having a fraternity brother who was agnostic. And I grew up in a very faith-based family environment, and I don't think I could have even defined agnostic as a first-year student, much less actually met someone who was.
Or know that it existed.
Yeah, and I don't know that that was bad or wrong, it just was.
Right.
You know? Like, I don't think anyone did anything wrong.
So it's acknowledging a reality that there are these differences.
They are. And it's harder to, you know, have exposure to certain groups depending on what parts of the country you live in.
So how did we get to this point, do you think, where there's a kind of dichotomy, perhaps a false dichotomy, between free speech on the one hand and making people feel welcome and included on the other?
Yeah, I mean, I think in part, and I'm sure you talk about this more than I, there's a lot of ignorance about what the First Amendment actually says.
Sure.
Right? And so when people talk about their demands for free speech, a lot of times you realize that they don't really understand that their free speech rights aren't actually being violated, because what they feel is protected by free speech, or should be, isn't actually what the Constitution talks about at all. Right? I'm sure there's some kids telling their parents, you're blocking my free speech.
Right, of course.
That's not what we're talking about at all. So I think there's a lot of ignorance about what free speech actually means. And I also think people who maybe came from spaces where their ideas were often affirmed or at least not criticized, now finding themselves in spaces where there's significant pushback, are just dealing with the shock and disappointment of the rejection of it all, right? And so me disagreeing with you or me saying you are wrong isn't a violation of your free speech. But I think in some university contexts, you're having some students who have ideas that aren't popular and are getting a bit of pushback, and they feel like their free speech rights are being violated. That's not what's actually happening.
Right. If you could define what the dialogue ought to be on college and university campuses now to prepare young people for citizenship, what would that look like?
That, to me, is a great question. So I am of the belief at this point, having graduated and been involved with academia a bit, that orientation may be more important than graduation, right? And so I really wish I would have paid attention to those first speeches. And it would be awesome if universities had people come in and just prepare the students for what they're about to encounter, that they knew going in that you're about to encounter some ideas that are very different from your own, that will offend you, that may hurt your feelings, and you really need to learn how to respond well. The person on the other side of this viewpoint isn't an idiot. They often have knowledge or perspective or experience or maybe even wisdom at 18 that you just don't, and that shapes their view. And so prepare people how to disagree well without being disagreeable. I don't think there are a lot of classes or even just lectures. I don't know that there needs to be a full class on just how to do life with people not like yourself.
Right.
Yeah.
And one of the problems that's going. I teach in 2 different universities at the moment, small seminars on free speech.
Great.
And one of the issues that has arisen that kind of surprised me. I thought I was sort of ready for all new ideas, but there is a feeling. Some of these surveys, perhaps unreliable, have shown that a small percentage of students at universities actually either voted for Trump themselves or their families were supporters
Sure.
of Donald Trump, even though that goes against the sort of sophisticated image of educated
Right.
people in this country
Sure.
at the moment. And there's a worry that people who admire the president are now going to be persecuted, or
Yeah.
that their views are going to be mocked, they'll be rejected, they'll be shoved off to the side somehow. How do we deal with that?
Yeah, in writing about identity, one thing I've discovered is that many groups have persecution complexes. Many groups are afraid that they will not be able to be who they actually are in this country based on the pushback and criticism they receive.
Right.
The problem with that is that some groups are actually more persecuted than others, and we certainly know this to be true globally. And so I think it's fine to feel wronged and feel less safe, but it's also helpful to be aware of the facts and put your anxieties and fears in perspective. So the reality is large percentages of the American population that are well represented on college campuses actually were on the Trump train. Trump won the white vote. Trump
Yes,
won the
he did.
wealthy vote. Trump
Right.
won the male vote. Trump won the white millennial vote. He won the white male millennial vote. There are a lot of people on college campuses that were way more supportive of Trump than I think people realize. And so this idea that I can't find my place here because everybody here is so progressive, I just don't think it's supported by the data. I think, though, what people could do a better job of doing is communicating why they voted for whoever they voted for in a way that would explain to other people why they were attracted to that candidate. So one thing that's really challenging with the 2016 election, and will be with every election probably moving forward, is if you tell me who you voted for, I will assume you voted for them for certain reasons. And the truth may not be the case.
Right.
And it may be the case, and it may be both. But if it is true that you did not vote for the president or his opponent for reasons I assume, you should be able to articulate that. And then perhaps the pushback that you're fearing may not be there. The reality is that the president did have an economic message and even a cultural message that a lot of people thought was great.
They were signing up for a different vision
Yeah.
that they thought might help solve some of the discomfort they were feeling.
Absolutely. My mom is from a small town in North Carolina that lost its factory that got shipped overseas, and about 18 miles north of that is a military base. Many people in that area did vote for the economic message that Trump had. They also voted for the cultural message in many ways. But if I assume they voted for him because they believe that both sides are wrong, that it's wrong on my part for making that assumption. But if you know that's not why you voted for him, you should also feel free to communicate that to people if you don't want them to walk around making those assumptions.
Yeah, there's a very interesting thing that happened some months ago where President Trump said that he thinks the free speech crisis on campuses is overblown. And he thought it for a very surprising reason, which is that he said everywhere he goes on college campuses, he's very well received.
Right.
And so what's all this talk that conservatives are not well received on campuses? And I think a lot of people are having a really hard time dealing with that, because on the one hand, those who don't want the college free speech crisis to be overblown don't want Donald Trump to agree with them.
Right, right.
It's support for them from the wrong quarter.
And that's the problem with tribalism, right? I mean, the reality is you would want great ideas supported regardless of who they come from. And you know, a broken clock is right twice a day, right? And so the idea that the president could never say something that people who are more progressive could agree with, it's sad and it's a bit problematic. But I'm glad he admitted that, because I agree as well. I was recently in a conversation where I believe that on any given week, I've written about higher education. I'm a fellow at Georgetown. I've been to school. Any given week, there are conservative speakers on many campuses.
Of course there are.
Any given week.
Yes.
And I was talking to a friend of mine who was expressing his frustration about, Condoleezza Rice being booed or protested when I think she wanted to speak at Rutgers, and how hostile the university is to conservatism. I said they didn't want Condoleezza Rice there speaking at that event. I'm sure that there were conservative speakers at that university that week in some other contexts. And I think that's what Trump's point was, that some conservatives are well received and will always perhaps be.
Right, and so it is certain instances of people who are well known, and actually Condoleezza Rice is not the best example because she really does have a message. She has experience. She's been out there.
Yeah, and I think she'd be received differently now than then. That was, I think, during the Iraq War.
That is probably true.
Right.
She'd be received differently now. But I think the point that's generalized is there are a few speakers who seem like they come more out of the circus or something than out of thoughtful dialogue.
Yeah.
Who get shouted down, who get and there's all this disruption. There are all the security costs to protect the community from them and all that. And that's what gets the attention.
Yeah. And that's concerning. I mean, when you think of the budget cuts going to state universities, and, I believe Berkeley and Florida both had to pay 6 figures to have certain speakers come in. And with tuition increasing, I mean, it's difficult for some people to understand why a university would pay so much money to bring a speaker to campus. That offends them when their tuition is going up.
And then has to spend money to protect the community on top of what they've paid.
It's a lot.
So how do we fix that?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you really want your message to go forward, this is obviously my personal opinion, and you think it matters, and you're also mindful of the impact financially of your voice being heard, maybe you shouldn't require universities to pay so much to bring you on campus.
Oh, well, of course.
Right? And that's not me arguing against you receiving speaking fees, but that's a lot of money to protect your free speech. There's got to be a more economical way to get your ideas heard.
But you're making a fundamentally anti-capitalist argument Gene, because you're saying that you shouldn't go for the highest price you can get. Or go for the
Yeah, I mean, I guess, as someone who went to a state school for undergrad, I'm just really mindful of the budget cuts, and I'm mindful of the number of kids who've had to leave because of funding not being available for them to continue their education. The idea of universities dedicating so much money to one speaker is just a little painful for me to entertain. But I think the reality is people have ideas that other people want to compensate, and sometimes those prices are really high.
And often the people who want to bring those speakers and want to pay them a lot of money are in total agreement with those speakers already.
Absolutely.
There's no great exchange of ideas that can be
maybe they should have their donors and their parents or their organizations pay instead of the taxpayers. One of the crazy things about public universities, as you know, is that people in states are paying taxes benefiting campuses that they'll never be able to step foot on, and that's problematic.
Right, because students are being admitted from outside the state to help the university's budget.
Absolutely. I mean, and there's just access issues in every state in terms of higher education. There's such a gap. One of the things that's really fascinating about the gap in tribes, one of my biggest takeaways from the 2016 election, if I could be a bit transparent, was just how ignorant I personally was about the challenges white working class Americans face. That's not to justify everything they said. I mean, we saw some problematic ideas regarding cultural issues come from the group based on their own admission. But I've only been in big urban spaces with highly educated people, and I don't know what it's like to face many of the challenges that they felt like Trump addressed.
Well, if I may say so, Gene, you were not alone in not
Absolutely.
being aware
Absolutely.
of these white working class anxieties. I think Hillary Clinton, it could be said, was not aware of them either.
Sure. No, I think so. And I mean, I think I remember watching Trump go speak in Mobile, Alabama. And I've been to Mobile, Alabama. And it's not often that reality television stars running for a top office go to Mobile, Alabama. And I think many people there were just very moved that he seemed to even be willing to spend a Friday night with them. And I think moving forward, what we'll probably see in future elections is candidates be more aggressive in going out to people and meeting with them whose votes they perhaps took for granted in the past.
So how do we reform the system so that everybody gets represented, feels spoken for and spoken to, and at the same time preserve robust free speech principles?
Yeah, it's going to be really difficult to get all voices at the table, but the move should be to get as many voices at the table as possible. And I think there are groups actually on both sides, multiple genders, multiple ethnicities, that are really working to try to elevate like grassroots voters. And we've seen that a bit with some of these elections after the 2016 presidential election, because elevating grassroots voters will bring about support for grassroots candidates. And helping get people the resources and support and buy-in to be involved in the conversation. I will say one thing we did learn in 2016 is that money does not matter as much as we thought it did, or at least isn't the only thing that matters.
Now there's a counterintuitive conclusion, isn't it?
Right. And it's not that it doesn't matter. Trump had more millions behind him than his supporters usually admit, but he certainly wasn't the individual who raised the most money. But you still need to have some type of support. And so I think what we're seeing is a demand and desire to get some people, especially at like the state government level, the support they need to get their ideas to the masses.
And so is there a role for the government and for the media as public service institutions to make sure this happens?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean,
How would you go about that?
Yeah, I'm a member of the mainstream media, but I'm such a supporter of media outlets beyond the mainstream media who have focused on making sure the ideas that the mainstream media doesn't always hit get attention. And so I read publications targeted towards Latinas and Native Americans and evangelical Christians and Muslims and baby boomers and millennials. And they make sure that their people, their constituency, know that there are people out there speaking to the issues that matter most to them, that aren't always making it into the headlines of the top publications.
So that's one of the many challenges we face to enhance both free speech and the national dialogue.
I think so, making sure that voices are supported and are seen and heard, but that they have the resources to make sure they can play in the big leagues as well.
One last question. One of the students I taught early on in this recent time of teaching about free speech said to me, you know, you can talk about free speech and you can talk about needing to let every idea get ventilated. This was a young man from Southern California, Korean American family, working class family. And he said, I did not spend my high school years discussing the great issues of our time over the dining room table. I arrived at college without a voice, in a sense. And he said, before we can say every idea has to be expressed and everyone has to be able to defend himself or herself against bad ideas, the playing field has to be leveled.
Yeah.
I need to be helped to be able to defend myself. How do we do that?
That's an interesting question, and I think it's not a question unique to 18-year-olds or children of immigrants or children who are working class. One of the fascinating questions I ask my students when I'm teaching about identity politics is, what are your dominant identities? Who are you, essentially? And I initially thought they'd be able to spit them out, but many people don't know. Many people haven't really thought about, how do I see the world? What matters most to me? What does it mean to be who I am and to come from the spaces that I come from? And so I think helping people realize that they do probably have a worldview, but they may not have thought much about it, and to discover it and to move forward from that. Another piece of that, which is a little different, is I think we could also do a great job of giving people space to change their worldviews, right? So it's been 18 years since I've been 18, and I have not processed most issues the same way over those years that I did back then. And I think a lot of times, especially when we're talking about political leaders who have long political careers, we often punish people for changing on policy issues and ideas.
We're sometimes suspicious of people who change their mind.
Yeah,
well,
because and rightly so. The motives behind changing in politics are sometimes sketchy, but the reality also is sometimes deeply held convictions change.
Of course they do.
You meet new people, you go new places, you read new things, you have new experiences, and the way you see the world and the way you feel about things changes and evolves or regresses or whatever word you want to use, but giving people space to figure out who they are and to realize that that's not like always a settled thing when you're dealing with people who are living for 80 years.
Right.
Yeah.
Gene, thank you very much.
Thanks for having me. This was great.
We've been discussing the crossroads of identity, politics, and free speech with Eugene Scott from the Washington Post. To learn more about Georgetown University's Free Speech Project, visit our website. Thank you for watching. I'm Sanford Unger.